4 things an avoidant will never tell you but you need to hear right now. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the person you've spent months, maybe even years trying to understand has been speaking a language you were never taught. Every delayed text, every sudden withdrawal, every moment that felt cold or confusing wasn't random at all. It was communication, not the kind that comes through words, but the kind hidden beneath silence. And that's the frustrating part, isn't it? Because silence has a way of making us create our own explanations. We assume they stopped caring. We assume they lost interest. We assume the connection meant more to us than it ever did to them. Yet some of the biggest truths inside an avoidant mind are rarely spoken out loud. They stay buried beneath distance, independence, and carefully controlled emotions. That's why in this video we're pulling back the curtain on 4 things an avoidant will almost never tell you directly but that you absolutely need to hear right now if you've ever found yourself lying awake at night trying to make sense of their behavior. And if you've ever watched one of these videos and thought, finally someone is putting words to what I've been experiencing, then do yourself a favor and hit subscribe. That way, every time we unpack the hidden psychology behind these relationship dynamics, you'll already have a front row seat. Because what we're about to explore might completely change the way you interpret the silence you've been struggling to understand. The hardest thing about trying to understand an avoidant is that you're often searching for answers in the exact place where answers rarely exist. Most people assume that if something is important, it will eventually be said. If someone cares, they'll tell you. If they're hurt, they'll express it. If they're afraid, they'll admit it. But avoidant individuals frequently operate according to a completely different emotional rulebook. Over time, many learned that exposing their inner world felt dangerous, uncomfortable, or simply unnecessary. Instead of sharing what they feel, they learned how to manage those feelings privately. Instead of reaching outward when emotions became intense, they learned to retreat inward. The result is someone who may appear calm, detached, and unaffected on the surface while carrying an entirely different experience beneath it. This doesn't mean they're plotting, manipulating, or intentionally confusing people. In many cases, concealment became a survival strategy long before they ever entered an adult relationship. It became automatic, almost instinctive, like putting on a coat before walking into cold weather. They don't always decide to hide, they simply do. And because of that, the people closest to them often find themselves staring at a blank emotional wall, wondering what exists behind it. The irony is that the wall itself becomes the source of endless misunderstanding. One person thinks silence means indifference. The other thinks silence is safety. One person wants more communication, the other wants more space, and neither fully understands what the other is actually experiencing. What makes this even more confusing is the enormous gap that can exist between what an avoidant feels and what they show. Many people believe emotions are visible. If someone loves you, you'll see it. If someone misses you, you'll know it. If someone is struggling, it will be obvious. But for avoidants, emotions often stay internalized. Feelings that would naturally be expressed by others are instead analyzed, compartmentalized, and kept private. An avoidant can spend hours thinking about a conversation and never mention it. They can replay memories repeatedly without ever admitting they miss someone. They can feel overwhelmed by emotional intensity while presenting themselves as completely fine. This creates one of the most painful experiences for the people who care about them. You're not responding to what they're feeling, you're responding to what they're showing. And what they're showing often looks nothing like what's happening inside. Imagine trying to measure the depth of an ocean while only looking at the surface. On a calm day, it appears still and predictable. Yet beneath that surface exists an entire world of movement, pressure, and complexity. That's often what relationships with avoidants feel like. You see the calm exterior, you experience the distance, you encounter the silence. But the emotional reality underneath may be far more active than you realize. Unfortunately, because that reality remains hidden, assumptions rush in to fill the empty space. And that's where the real damage often begins, because when human beings don't receive answers, they create them. The unanswered text becomes proof of rejection. The canceled plans become proof of disinterest. The emotional distance becomes proof that the relationship never mattered. Little by little, a story forms. A story built not on certainty but on interpretation. The problem is that constantly chasing explanations from someone who struggles to provide them can become emotionally exhausting. It can consume your thoughts, you replay conversations, you search for clues, you analyze every interaction, you become convinced that if you just ask the right question, you'll finally unlock the truth. Yet the more you chase certainty, the more frustrated you become. Not because your need for clarity is unreasonable, but because you're expecting someone who avoids emotional exposure to suddenly become emotionally transparent. The result is a painful cycle. You push harder for answers, they withdraw further. Their withdrawal increases your anxiety. Your anxiety increases their discomfort, and before long, both people are reacting to the cycle rather than each other. What's especially heartbreaking is that many people spend years believing they simply haven't tried hard enough. They think one more conversation will solve everything, one more explanation, one more attempt to get through. Yet understanding avoidant behavior often begins when you stop focusing exclusively on what they refuse to say and start understanding why they struggle to say it in the first place. Which brings us to the first truth they rarely reveal. If an avoidant could sit down with complete honesty, with no fear, no defenses, and no instinct to protect themselves, many would admit something that surprises almost everyone. I think about you more than you realize. That's the secret most people never see because they're looking for evidence in all the wrong places. They expect emotional investment to look obvious. They expect frequent communication, consistent reassurance, and visible longing. But avoidants often experience attachment in quieter, less visible ways. The connection doesn't necessarily disappear when the conversation ends. The thoughts don't always stop when distance appears. The memories don't automatically fade simply because they seem detached. In fact, one of the biggest misconceptions about avoidance is that emotional distance equals emotional absence. Those are not the same thing. An avoidant may create physical space while still carrying the relationship mentally. They may appear unaffected while privately revisiting moments that mattered to them. They may remain silent while wondering how you're doing. None of this means every avoidant secretly longs for every person from their past. It doesn't mean silence should be romanticized or that mixed signals should be excused, but it does mean the story is often more complicated than it appears. And in the next part, we'll uncover why many avoidants work so hard to hide that attachment in the first place, even when revealing it could bring them closer to the very person they can't stop thinking about. The reason many avoidants hide their attachment is because attachment itself can feel like the beginning of vulnerability, and vulnerability can feel like the beginning of danger. To someone with a more secure relationship style, realizing you care about someone often feels comforting. It creates warmth, excitement, and a desire for greater connection. But for many avoidants, the experience is far more complicated. Caring deeply doesn't just create closeness, it also creates risk. The more important someone becomes, the more power they have to disappoint, reject, overwhelm, or hurt. And while most people respond to that risk by leaning in and building trust, avoidants often respond by increasing emotional control. They tell themselves not to get too attached. They minimize their feelings. They convince themselves they need less than they actually do. It's not because they enjoy emotional distance, it's because distance feels manageable. Dependence does not. Deep down, many avoidants have spent years associating self-sufficiency with safety. They learned that relying on others can lead to pain, so they developed a habit of relying almost exclusively on themselves. The problem is that human connection doesn't operate according to those rules. You cannot experience genuine intimacy while remaining completely untouched by another person. So an internal conflict begins. Part of them wants the connection. Another part wants protection from the connection. And when those two forces collide, silence often becomes the compromise. Rather than admit how much someone matters, they keep it hidden where it feels safer. Not because the feelings aren't real, but because acknowledging them makes those feelings impossible to ignore. What's fascinating is that despite how carefully avoidants try to conceal attachment, traces of it often leak through in subtle ways. Most people imagine emotional investment as grand gestures and dramatic confessions, but that's rarely how it appears. Instead, it hides inside small details that are easy to miss unless you're paying close attention. An avoidant who claims not to think much about someone may remember a tiny comment from months ago. They may notice changes that others overlook. They may recall conversations almost word for word. Sometimes they quietly check for updates, revisit old messages, or mentally replay interactions long after they happened. They may never announce that they're doing these things. In fact, many would feel uncomfortable admitting it. Yet these behaviors reveal something important. Emotional investment doesn't always look like emotional expression. The person who seems detached may actually be carrying pieces of the connection far longer than anyone realizes. This is one reason relationships involving avoidance can feel so confusing. Their inner experience and outer behavior often fail to match. The outside says, "I'm fine." The inside says, "I'm still processing." The outside says, "I need space." The inside says, "I don't know what to do with these feelings." The outside appears indifferent. The inside remains occupied. And because most people only see the outside, they underestimate how much is happening beneath the surface. But before anyone watching starts using this as proof that every avoidant secretly harbors hidden feelings, there's an important truth that needs to be understood. The goal isn't to encourage endless waiting. It's not to convince yourself that silence automatically means devotion. One of the biggest mistakes people make is becoming emotionally trapped between hope and reality. They spend months searching for hidden meanings while ignoring visible actions. They cling to potential while neglecting what is actually happening in front of them. Understanding that an avoidant may think about you more than they admit can provide clarity, but clarity should never become an excuse to abandon your own needs. Relationships are built on more than private feelings. They're built on communication, consistency, effort, and mutual participation. Someone can care deeply and still be unavailable. Someone can think about you constantly and still fail to create a healthy relationship. Those realities can exist at the same time. That's why understanding avoidant psychology is most useful when it helps you see situations more clearly, not when it encourages you to remain stuck in them. The question isn't simply whether they care. The question is whether their actions create the kind of connection that allows both people to feel valued, respected, and emotionally secure. Because hidden feelings, no matter how genuine, cannot replace visible effort. And that brings us to the second thing avoidants almost never say out loud. If they were willing to reveal one of their most uncomfortable truths, many would admit something that sounds shocking at first. Your emotional intensity sometimes scares me. Now, before you misunderstand that statement, this isn't necessarily about anger, drama, or unhealthy behavior. Often the intensity they're reacting to is perfectly normal. Honest conversations about feelings, requests for reassurance, discussions about commitment, questions about the future. Moments that many people would consider essential parts of a healthy relationship can feel overwhelming to someone who has spent years avoiding emotional exposure. Imagine spending your entire life keeping certain emotional doors locked, only to meet someone who gently, and sometimes not so gently, keeps trying to open them. Even if that person has good intentions, the experience can feel deeply uncomfortable. The avoidant isn't always afraid of the other person. They're often afraid of what gets activated inside themselves. Conversations that require vulnerability force them to confront emotions they've spent years managing through distance and control. Suddenly, feelings they prefer to keep contained begin demanding attention. And for someone whose instinct is to create space whenever emotions become intense, that experience can feel almost unbearable. This is why withdrawal is so often misunderstood. When people experience an avoidant pulling away after an emotionally significant conversation, the immediate assumption is usually rejection. If they cared, they wouldn't leave. If they loved me, they would stay present. If the relationship mattered, they would talk it through. While those reactions are understandable, they don't always reflect what's happening internally. Many avoidants withdraw because they feel emotionally flooded. The conversation creates more emotional activation than they know how to regulate in real time. Their nervous system interprets the intensity as pressure, even when no pressure is intended. So they do what they've always done when overwhelmed. They create distance. That distance isn't necessarily a statement about the other person's value. It's often an attempt to regain a sense of internal stability. The tragedy is that the person left behind rarely experiences it that way. They experience abandonment. They experience confusion. They experience hurt. One person is trying to calm their internal overwhelm. The other is trying to understand why they suddenly feel shut out. And in that painful gap between intention and impact, countless relationships begin to unravel. Because what looks like indifference from one side may actually be emotional overload from the other. And until both realities are understood, the cycle continues repeating itself in ways that leave everyone feeling misunderstood, disconnected, and alone. And once that pattern begins, something almost inevitable happens. The person craving connection starts moving closer, while the avoidant starts moving farther away. Not because either person is trying to create pain, but because each is responding to discomfort in the only way they know how. One seeks relief through closeness. The other seeks relief through distance. The more uncertainty the pursuer feels, the more questions they ask. The more questions they ask, the more pressure the avoidant experiences. The more pressure the avoidant experiences, the more they retreat. And the more they retreat, the more desperate the pursuer becomes for reassurance. What started as a simple desire for connection gradually transforms into a cycle that feeds itself. Neither side feels understood. Neither side feels safe. Both become trapped inside reactions instead of genuine communication. The painful irony is that each person is often trying to solve the same problem. They both want security, they both want certainty, they both want to feel emotionally safe with the other person. Yet their methods directly conflict with one another. One reaches outward, one pulls inward. And because those strategies collide instead of complementing each other, the relationship begins to feel like a tug of war where everyone is losing. This is why so many people walk away from avoidant relationships believing they were never loved enough, while many avoidants walk away feeling they were never accepted as they were. Both leave carrying wounds, both leave believing the other person failed to understand them, and the cycle continues into the next relationship unless something changes. What makes this dynamic even more heartbreaking is that many people respond to it by increasing the very behavior that's creating the problem. They assume more effort will finally break through the wall, more conversations, more explanations, more emotional intensity, more attempts to prove loyalty, commitment, and love. Yet when dealing with avoidance, pressure rarely creates openness. In fact, it often produces the opposite result. Think about what happens when someone feels cornered emotionally. They don't suddenly become more vulnerable. They become more defensive. They become more focused on escape. They become more determined to protect whatever emotional space they still possess. This doesn't mean your needs are wrong. It doesn't mean your desire for clarity is unreasonable. It simply means that intensity often lands differently inside an avoidant nervous system than it does inside yours. What feels like connection seeking to one person can feel like emotional overwhelm to another. And this is the lesson many people learn far too late. You cannot force emotional availability into existence. No amount of love can make someone ready before they are ready. No amount of patience can create self-awareness on someone else's behalf. No amount of sacrifice can substitute for genuine emotional growth. Understanding this isn't about giving up, it's about recognizing reality. Because the moment you stop trying to control another person's emotional journey is often the moment you begin reclaiming your own. And that's where the third hidden truth begins to emerge. If an avoidant were willing to expose something they almost never admit, many would quietly confess, "I notice when you pull away." Now, this statement surprises people because avoidants often work very hard to appear unaffected. They may seem calm when communication decreases. They may appear indifferent when someone becomes less available. They may continue their routines as though nothing has changed, yet beneath that appearance something else is frequently happening. Human beings are remarkably sensitive to changes in emotional patterns, and avoidants are no exception. In fact, because they spend so much time monitoring emotional pressure, they often become acutely aware when that pressure suddenly disappears. The person who always reached out stops reaching out. The person who always initiated contact becomes quiet. The person who consistently made the effort suddenly redirects their energy elsewhere. These shifts rarely go unnoticed. The difference is that avoidants don't always respond in obvious ways. They may observe before acting. They may process privately. They may spend considerable time trying to understand why the dynamic feels different. From the outside, it can look like nothing is happening. Internally, however, an important realization may be taking place. Something familiar has changed. Something predictable is no longer predictable. This is one reason distance can completely alter the emotional landscape. When someone is constantly available, avoidants can unconsciously assume the connection will remain there, not because they're arrogant or entitled, but because human beings naturally adapt to what feels stable. We stop noticing what seems permanent. We stop appreciating what appears guaranteed. But when that certainty disappears, attention shifts. Suddenly there is room for reflection, room for curiosity, room for feelings that were previously buried beneath routines and defenses. This doesn't mean distance is a manipulation tactic. Genuine distance is not about creating jealousy or playing games. It's about redirecting energy back toward your own life. Yet when that happens authentically, something interesting often occurs. The avoidant loses the constant emotional pressure they were reacting to. Without that pressure occupying their attention, they sometimes begin confronting thoughts they had been avoiding. Memories become louder. Questions become harder to ignore. The connection becomes easier to evaluate honestly because they are no longer focused entirely on escaping emotional intensity. What once felt overwhelming may suddenly feel valuable. What once felt restrictive may suddenly feel meaningful. And for perhaps the first time, they are left alone with their own emotions instead of reacting to someone else's. But this doesn't create clarity overnight. In many cases, it creates conflict, because beneath the surface of avoidance exists a battle that few people ever see. One part of them wants connection, another part wants freedom. One part longs to be understood, another part fears being fully known. One part misses the relationship, Another part remembers the discomfort that accompanied it. These competing desires don't take turns, they often exist simultaneously. That's why avoidance can appear so contradictory. They may move closer one moment and farther away the next. They may express affection and then create distance. They may miss someone deeply while resisting the urge to reconnect. To outsiders, these contradictions can seem irrational, but internally they make perfect sense. The avoidant isn't choosing between caring and not caring. They're often choosing between two needs that both feel important: the need for connection and the need for self-protection, the need for intimacy and the need for autonomy, the need to be close and the need to feel safe. Understanding this internal conflict doesn't excuse hurtful behavior, nor does it guarantee a relationship can succeed. What it does provide is a deeper understanding of why avoidants sometimes seem to move in opposite directions at the same time. Because while others see inconsistency, they are often experiencing an unresolved battle between fear and desire that has been shaping their relationships for far longer than anyone realizes. And that internal battle helps explain something that confuses people more than almost anything else: why some avoidants suddenly reappear after long periods of silence. From the outside, it can seem random. Weeks pass, sometimes months, in some cases even longer. Just when it feels like the chapter is completely closed, a message appears, a casual check-in, a memory, a question, a simple attempt to reconnect. For the person who is left behind, the timing often feels baffling. Why now? Why after all this time? Why after creating so much distance? The answer is rarely as simple as most people hope. Sometimes the avoidant has finally had enough space to process emotions they couldn't face while the relationship was active. Sometimes the absence of the other person created a perspective that wasn't available before. Sometimes they genuinely miss the connection. Sometimes nostalgia begins highlighting the good moments while softening the difficult ones. Sometimes they realize that what once felt permanently available is no longer guaranteed. Human beings often understand the value of something more clearly when they can no longer reach out and touch it whenever they want. But perhaps the most important thing to understand is this: reconnection does not automatically mean transformation. Missing someone and being ready for a healthy relationship are not always the same thing. An avoidant can sincerely miss a person while still carrying the same fears that created distance in the first place. This is why so many reconnecting relationships feel hopeful at the beginning and confusing later. The feelings may be real, but the underlying patterns remain unchanged. Until those patterns are addressed, old dynamics have a way of finding their way back into the room. Which leads us to the deepest truth of all, the fourth thing avoidants almost never say directly. If every defense disappeared and every emotional wall came down, many would eventually reveal a truth that changes the entire picture. I'm more afraid than you think, not stronger than you think, not colder than you think, not more detached than you think, more afraid than you think. Fear sits quietly beneath many avoidant behaviors, yet because it rarely looks like fear, people often miss it completely. We tend to recognize fear when it appears as anxiety, nervousness, or visible vulnerability. Avoidant fear wears a different disguise. It hides inside independence. It hides inside emotional control. It hides inside withdrawal. It hides inside the insistence that everything is fine. The avoidant may fear rejection, but they also fear dependence. They may fear abandonment, but they may also fear losing themselves inside a relationship. They may fear being hurt, but they may equally fear needing someone too much. These fears create impossible-seeming contradictions. They want connection, yet connection activates vulnerability. They want intimacy, yet intimacy requires exposure. They want love, yet love inevitably introduces uncertainty. So they stand at the edge of closeness, wanting something that simultaneously attracts and frightens them. And because most people only witness the distancing behavior, they assume confidence where fear actually